Hey, drywall repairman here. Thanks for visiting my channel. I am a licensed drywaller. I do a lot of drywall repairs. Patches on ceilings, patches on walls, stress cracks. Simple do-it-yourself type drywall repairs you can do. So please watch and learn these videos and please subscribe. Thanks for viewing.
Hello everybody, here's a new video, just another ceiling patch, 5 foot by 3 foot patch on a closet ceiling. This is caused from the leaking AC condensation line. Very common job. The homeowner already went through the trouble of cutting out the area, mostly cutting it out nice, so it saves some money on the project. They weren't comfortable in sheetrocking and all that. That's understandable. Maybe you're trying to do a project like this and you're not confident in all the step process. But maybe you can do a step or two to save some money on your project. So always ask your contractor, what can you do to save some money? Basically on this area I got here, first thing I always do on any job is I always put down plastic, tarp, stuff like that to contain the mess area. You always want to catch your mess. You are going to be dropping mud. You're working with muds and waters and stuff like that. So you always want to catch your mess. On here I need to cut it back another inch or so. So I use a T-square. T-square, or a level, or a piece of wood, level straight edge, pencil, razor blade, and a tape measure. You just want to tape measure off your area, get your dimensions, and then you want to pencil off the area that you're going to cut out. I'm cutting it out using a razor blade. I use a razor blade method because it doesn't make a lot of dust. If you're not comfortable using a razor blade, you can also use a keyhole saw, hand saw, whatever you have to use it. You just got to take your time. You're working with tools and knives here. This is not a rush job. You're not in a hurry. If you're in a hurry to get this job done, maybe you should hire a professional. That takes their time. Get the job all cut out nicely. It's always a step process that takes the most time. The prep work, getting it all demoed out, cleaned up, ready. Once you get it all cut out, you always want to add backing. I always add backing in between the trusses. You necessarily don't have to do this, but it's a very important step process if you want a nice, perfect patch. Tightens up everything, keeps everything tight. Add plenty of screws. The rule here is always screws every 2 to 4 inches. Add plenty of screws. In your backing, you need to add 2 to 3 minimum screws to hold your backing in place. Add plenty of screws on the outside edges of the original wall or ceiling. This is to tighten up the studs, tighten up the existing ceiling. You just remove the patch so it loosened up the ceiling. So now you got to retighten it up. Add plenty of screws, Make sure the area is ready, scraped. All the screws are set depth. This countersunk in the sheetrock, you don't want screw heads sticking out. So when you go to mud, if you have screw heads sticking out, you're not going to like that. Add plenty of screws, take your time, add plenty of screws. It's the most important thing is plenty of screws. Once you get everything all screwed up, ready to go, you can install the new sheetrock. Most ceilings in houses, interior houses, are 1/2 inch sheetrock, but you always want to measure. Sometimes there is 5/8 involved, so you always want to make sure you have the correct sheetrock. You don't want to use 5/8 on a 1/2 inch ceiling or 1/2 inch ceiling 5/8, vice versa. Add plenty of screws in your outside edges and then add plenty of screws on your new sheetrock. Every 2 to 4 inches is an easy rule of thumb, nice symmetrical layout on your screw pattern. You don't want no screw heads sticking out, but you also don't want screws sunk in too deep. You don't want to break the paper on the sheetrock. You just want them recessed in so nail heads and screw heads are not sticking out. Add plenty of screws. If you need to cut back the sheetrock, you use your razor blade to make it fit in perfect. You're basically cutting a puzzle piece to fit back in place. Once you get everything screwed up, add plenty of screws, everything looks good. You always want to take a 6-inch knife and scrape your areas before you do any taping. You want to get any loose boogers out of there, anything loose. Make sure there's no screw heads sticking out. Just by running the 6-inch knife over this will save you a lot of hassles on the mudding process. Always go through. I use fiberglass mesh tape. There's a lot of tapes out there. Fiberglass is the go-to item. I don't care what anybody says. I use fiberglass on 98% of my jobs. Paper tape is only used in angles and certain jobs, so just stick to your fiberglass mesh tapes and you won't have any troubles on your drywall repair process. Fiberglass mesh, if there is gaps in the area, sometimes you can do 2 layers of fiberglass mesh. No problem. It gives you extra sense of security that it won't crack out. I've never had a crack out job with these fiberglass because I had plenty of fiberglass on all the joints everywhere. Once you get the fiberglass installed, you want to press down with your 6 to make sure it's nice and flat and everything's ready. You're ready for mudding. I'm using a hot mud. You can use a joint compound, but on these jobs I use hot muds. Like my other videos, this is a 5-minute mud. I mix it by pan. A couple scoops, 2 or 3 scoops in your pan. I'm using an 18-inch pan, so it's a bigger pan. 3 scoops of hot mud for about 2 scoops of water is a ratio usually. You need to sprinkle in a little more water, a little more powder, go ahead, thicken up the mud. It is a first coat, so you want it fairly thick. If you're comparing it to other materials, maybe a thick pancake or a bread dough. I'm pushing in the mud inside the gap between the fiberglass and the sheetrock. That's to get the mud inside the groove there. Then basically just using my pan of mud. This is a bigger patch, so I'm going to use 2 pans of mud, but I'm just putting the mud where it's needed. I like to fill in these tape seams first. That's step 1. And then when I have extra mud, I'm going to use it to turn around and start coating the patch. You're working with hot muds. You don't have to put the mud on really thick. It's a hot mud material. It's not like a regular joint compound. Joint compounds you put on a little heavier because they do shrink back overnight. If you're not confident in using muds, always use a joint compound. Joint compounds have to dry overnight, but if you do make a mistake with the joint compound, it's easier to sand it away and start over. With these hot muds, they set up like a cement. That's why they're called hot muds. This is a 5-minute mud, so I work fast. I use a pan at a time. If you're working with like a 40-minute mud or a 90-minute mud, you can probably mix a half a bucket or so. With these 5-minute muds and maybe 20-minute muds, you want to mix pan by pan and just use what you got. Get the patch coated out nicely. You're not putting on the mud super heavy. You're just doing, just a heavy skim coat really over the patch. You don't want a big old hump on the wall or the ceiling. So you do a nice skim patch. And if it takes 2 or 3 more coats, skim coats, then go ahead and do that. It's easier to skim it out another coat than it is to have a big hump on your ceiling because you put too much materials on the wall. With these hot muds, you always want to wash out your tools right away. If you don't have a hose hookup like this, then you can use a water bucket and sponge technique. But always keep your tools clean, keep everything clean as you go. Once the hot mud's set up, we do the slick out technique with a 6-inch knife and a sponge. This is the easiest way to work with hot muds. You don't wait till the hot mud sets up. You got to catch it as it's setting up. This is a 5-minute mud, so I'm catching it at the 5-minute mark or so and slicking it out. I'm basically taking the wet sponge, hitting the outside edge to feather the edge, and then I'm slicking it out, taking off the extra materials, basically pushing down, taking off the extra materials. If you do this correctly, it's almost like a second coat. You're slicking it out, slicking out hot muds. This is the same technique with 5-minute muds, 20-minute muds, 40-minute muds, and 90-minute muds. Joint compounds, however, you have to sand down the next day. This is for hot muds only, and I have several videos showing this technique. If you're not comfortable working with hot muds, always use a joint compound. Always use joint compounds if you never worked with muds before. Now I'm ready for a second coat. I'm doing the same thing here, just 3 scoops, a couple scoops of water. Second coat doesn't have to be as thick as your first coat, so you can sprinkle in a little more water to get it a little thinner. You don't want it soaking wet mud. You don't want it dripping everywhere, but you want it thin enough to go on nice slick because you're doing a nice skim coat with the second coat. I like to put all my mud on that I have in my pan, and then I go through and trowel it out. Skim it out. Sometimes it's better to mix pan by pan when you're doing patches like this because you don't use and waste a lot of materials. So you use exactly what you mix up. A patch like this, a 5 foot by 3 foot, it took 2 pans to coat it, first coat, and then I think a pan to second coat. So you only use three pans, less than 4 pans of mud for the total job. Get the area all slicked out and ready to go, then she's ready to go. Use up all your mud on your pan. Any extra mud, just dump it on your plastic. You don't want this mud setting up in your pans. Clean your tools, clean your hands. You don't want this mud drying out your skin, so you always keep everything clean with fresh water whenever possible. A washout area with the hose is always preferred. If you don't have this, then just use a bucket and water. Keep everything clean. Same thing as the first coat. You do this slick out technique with a 6-inch knife and a sponge. A clean 6-inch knife, and you just slick it out. You're just taking off the extra materials, and by slicking it out like this, it's turning into a third coat. So we actually do 2 coats, but when it's all said and done by slicking it out, we got 4 coats of mud on here by slicking it out. It's a perfect smooth patch. Those hot muds, they set up like a cement, so it's a strong materials. It takes a lot to crack out hot muds. Get it all slicked out and looks good. Take your sponge and you can feather out the outside edge where the patch meets the existing texture. You want to get rid of that edge. Feathering out the edges is always important on all patchworks. No matter what texture it is, you always want to feather out that edge. If you're working with joint compounds, then you're going to have to sand that edge out. If you're working with hot muds, then you're going to have to use a wet sponge to feather out that edge so it blends into the existing texture. This is just called a Santa Fe skip. It's a real heavy Santa Fe. Santa Fe's out here just like a smooth texture, but this has a lot of skip. It's a busy Santa Fe. Your region might have a different type of texture depending on your region or texture type. You just want to match what you have there, but the